Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Berman. Today, I'm joined by James Valliant and Professor Robert Eisenman. And today, we're going to be talking about Eisenman's book, James, the Brother of Jesus. I have questions regarding his work on that book. Some of these questions also link with his other book, The New Testament Code. I will leave links to his books on Amazon. Those Amazon links will be in the description below. So if any of you want to go buy his books, I recommend you do so. I do recommend these books. I enjoyed reading these books, and I'm very happy to bring him back to this channel for the third time. So that brings me to my first question. Professor Eisenman, what kind of parallels are there between James the Just and the Teacher of Righteousness? Like, what would you say are like the best parallels?
The main thing that blows everything else away, then that is mind-boggling important, is the fact that Christian literature gives him, and Josephus too, gives him the title of the Just One. And that is a unique title in I don't know what to call this area at this time, but we'll call it Palestina, the Roman name if you want. But that's a unique title. And the only place it's really found is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the righteous one, which is James the Just in Latin, James the Just, James the righteous one, it carries on like that. I mean, there's another James in the scripture, but he doesn't get any titles, and I don't even think he's, as I've said previously, historical. So when I talk about him, I usually talk about him as James Zippity Doodah. Because I consider the Gospels to be sort of literary creations, but not particularly, Greco-Roman literature. That's why they're written in Greek and sometimes read in Latin, but they're never in Hebrew. So they're not Hebrew literature. And so they're Greco-Roman literature, and there's a just Zebedee or Zippity takes the James the Just. They're both, pardon me, they're both brothers of someone. But the point is James and John, the sons of Zebedee, really are not real characters. And the real character is James, the brother of Jesus. Excuse me. I don't know why I'm coughing here, but I am.
Was the righteous one a leadership title, do you think, for the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian community?
I think absolutely.
And
I don't think that, I mean, they were all quasi-righteous ones. Sons of Zadok, ZDK. Zadok is a high priest with the initials embedded in his name based on the ZDK root, which means just one. But the righteous teacher, the teacher of righteousness, wherever you find him in the Pesherim, the underlying word is always tzaddik. So the teacher of righteousness was clearly considered by them not just a tzaddik, but the tzaddik. So therefore, when you get a James character, which is Greco-Romanized into James, there is no James in Palestina at this time. I'm not calling it Israel because there's no Israel at this time, for that matter. So I have to give it the Roman provincial name. So you don't have it in this context any other place but in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And so we have a James who, if we go by Galatians and the tradition, at least in Acts, we have James who's the leader of a movement, apparently a Torah Orthodox movement, and certainly the second century Christian literature clearly calls this James the just one, the righteous one, over and over. It's, embedded in Christian.
I'm not even sure if he isn't referred that way at one point in Josephus, and he's referred that point one in the we document in Acts, which is extremely important, because the we document in Acts is actually, not just authentic, but it is the literature of the time, which is accurate history. I wouldn't say that first part of Acts is a reliable presentation. But the moment you get into the we document, which is from about Acts 16 onwards, the middle of 16, then you're in true literature, true history, and real people. And of course, that begins with James the Just, not and the so-called conference that they're having, not zippity doo dah.
But that suggests that there's a continuity of the community and leadership of the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians to James, the leader of whoever this community before Paul was, which sort of, and he's the leader of it. There's no question in Galatians that he's the leader of this movement.
Well, I don't think there is a community, what we call Christian, before Paul, because Paul is uniquely, I would consider, to be the really first Christian. And I think he spent time, as I say in my books, at the Qumran community. But his idea, because he knows their ideas to some extent, but his ideas are so unpleasant to them and negative that I think he was expelled. And at that point, plus don't forget, he's a Roman citizen and he's a member of the Herodian family. So, this is not a nationalist Jew. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, you just look at them, they're completely nationalist. I mean, you look at the war scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's called the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, best term they could give it. And you see, as it moves along, it gets extremely nationalistic to the extent that the war is a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. So they're looking forward to an apocalyptic war, not only evil, but against the whole of the Roman Empire. And I think that people that committed suicide on Masada, the remnants of the Dead Sea Scroll community, in my view, that is exactly what they were looking forward to, which is what their revolt was all about. But they had the unfortunate notion that if they were perfectly righteous, guess what would happen? The heavenly host would join their community. That's in the war scroll. So they didn't imagine they could win by themselves. But once they got the heavenly host on their side, nobody could stand in their way. Well, I think they were as righteous as you could get. But unfortunately, ideas like that are more the stuff of dreams or hopefulness, not reality. And they paid the final price for it.
Speaking on the term Zadik being a title in the
Zadik.
yeah.
Don't say Zadik. Zadik. Emphasize the second.
Zadik.
Zadik.
The Damascus document places a teacher of righteousness approximately 390 plus 20 years after the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, which was supposed to happen just about 586 BCE. And in Second Maccabees, and Josephus talks about this as well. There was a particular person that was appointed high priest, Jason the Just, or Jason the Zadik, around 176 BCE.
He must have had a Hebrew name, because I'm not familiar with that particular name.
Yeah, the original name appeared to be Yeshua.
Okay.
Yeah, he was put in power about that year, and then 4 years later,
as your audience probably realizes, go ahead.
4 years later, 172 BCE, there was a Seleucid sympathizer called Menelaus, and Menelaus, yeah, he outbid Jason financially, and Jason was booted out of the high priesthood, and then Menelaus was put in charge in his place.
Why are we interested in this?
Well, what I wanted to ask you about is that this it seems to fit the timing that the Damascus document is talking about in this instance. Do you think because of that?
I don't think it does, because I think, first of all, the whole of the literature has been miscalculated where time goes. And the only documents that you can really get a handle on time are the so-called Pesherim, which are the interpretation of biblical scripture, which could then go on to historical characters in their interpretations. And that's where the problem of misdating comes. So when you get into the Pesherim, just about all of the Pesherim are either the end of the first century BC or the first century CE. In fact, they're mostly CE, and that's what I've shown, that something like the Habakkuk Pesher is basically around contemporary with James. So I don't know anything about things that are pre-Maccabean in the scroll literature, because I don't think that there was any scroll literature that's pre-Maccabean. That's what you're talking about. And I don't know where that particular material you're talking about enters into it.
I just wanted to ask because I was trying to see how you viewed the 390 plus 20 years in the wilderness that the Damascus document was talking about. That's all.
Well, again, my memory doesn't encapsulate it very, very well. So I'm not sure if we're talking about past history or future history. But if it's past history, then it's what occurred before they returned from Babylon to resettle the country. If it's future history, then it's going to be what's going to happen to them after the final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth.
Speaking on the dating of the scrolls, one of the scrolls I wanted to ask you about is Pesher Hosea. It mentions that at one point there's no more high priest. I mean, there's no more priest. Period. Actually, it just says no more priests. And do you think that's good evidence that conforms to your dating of the scrolls? That seems to would you say that indicates that this document is aware that the high priesthood has come to an end on 70 CE?
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with that passage that you're talking about.
Okay.
So I really can't judge it according to my lights, not according to your lights. I mean, you want to read it to me, you can, and I'll try to.
I'll see if I can find it.
He's gone.
Just take a second. Jacob is amazing. He can zero in on his citation. He's got an amazing library, and he's got an amazing memory. He can zero in and put his finger on just about anything in a matter of seconds.
Well, it's better than me then. Well, he's younger, so he's got less stored up.
Not finding young fingers.
Hey, well, what I was saying is that, all the Pesherim are fairly late, and if something is in the Pesherim, like if you can read me, which relates to this period, I'm quite sure it'll be late first century BC, early first century CE. I should say BCE, I guess, but it's too clumsy.
All right. Well, let me just take this moment to say something to the audience generally.
I found it, by the way.
I'm sorry?
I found it, but go ahead, James. I'll mention.
I at some point during this conversation, I just wanted to say out loud and make sure that our audience understands this. Professor Robert Eisenman, in his work, has wrought nothing short of a revolution in the field, in my estimation. He has cut through the simplistic, shallow understanding of first century Judaism, the traditional identifications that we get from Josephus and Philo of Sadducee, Pharisee, Essene, and he's cut through to the real ideological and political differences that I think divided Jewish thought in the first century in a more essential and important way. So whether or not you agree with everything that Professor Eisenman says in his amazing books, and I really urge everyone to read them, it is a sea change in the field. It allows us to understand, as Professor Eisenman just explained in an earlier answer, that New Testament literature written in Greek is Greco-Roman literature. The recent scholarship of Professor Robin Faith Walsh, for example, has, I think, started to confirm this, and I think scholars will come around to this in time, that in fact the Gospels were written by Greco-Roman elites. She goes so far as to argue they may not have been Christians, but they were certainly Greco-Roman elites.
Well,
And
they certainly didn't want any war against Rome, and they certainly wanted you to turn the other cheek, and they certainly wanted you to love your enemy, and so on. That does not reflect anything which I hesitate to call, but have to, Palestinian.
I have to say that he is, in effect, and people who are familiar with my work in creating Christ and Roman providence theory in general have to understand that Professor Eisenman is really the fountainhead, the source of this, the turning point in this, the watershed moment that allowed us to understand these ideological differences for what they are, and have opened up, I think, an entire new understanding, an entire new chapter in biblical critical history.
Well, James and I are both on the West Coast, so that shields us from a whole continent of misunderstandings. And then when you move across the Atlantic, you're even getting more. So you can't get any further out into the wilderness unless you get to Australia or someplace.
Exactly. Well, we're out here in the wilderness in Qumran,
Yeah, we sure are.
in Damascus,
But,
away.
but you live in a certainly beautiful wilderness in the San Diego area. That's a can't get any more heart pleasing than that.
I am spoiled. Jacob has the quote.
It's in 4Q 167. It says here, "For I am like a panther to Ephraim, a lion to the house of Judah." This refers to the last priest who will stretch forth his hand to smite Ephraim.
Well, it's definitely the period that I'm talking about. The last priest will be someone like James, who is considered to be a priest because the righteous ones were priests as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls go, and they're all priests, and he would be a kind of, as we've already discussed, a high priest. So the last priest would be someone like that. But unfortunately, he was set up, and we do have the accurate story, I think, in Josephus and early church literature derivative from him on how he was set up. And the weird thing is that he was pushed from a corner of the Temple Mount wall and fell into the valley beneath. And for a while, his body remained there, and they constructed a marker there. But at some point, as we approached the Crusades and thereafter, they took supposedly his bones or his body to what's called St. James, Santiago de Compostela, and reburied them there. Now, whether they really are there or not, I don't know, but we know where they were in Palestina or Jerusalem or whatever you want to call the neighborhood that we're talking about, which is right below the Mount of Olives. And I lived on the Mount of Olives for 2 or 3 years, so I was like so familiar with it. It was like the palm of my hand.
Wow.
What did we interrupt you there with?
So you would identify the James movement as a leading rebel movement, as the rebels themselves.
Oh, it was the Sadiq, the principal Sadiq, was the leader, though I don't think he had to plan anything. The people were planning the whole thing themselves through their literature. But he was and when Paul, and I do blame Paul for this, identified him as the enemy, or Paul was the enemy, but Paul identified James as the enemy, and he had links to the Herodian establishment, then they took him and they threw him off the temple wall, and he was killed. And that was, I don't know if that was a catastrophe or not, but the movement went on, and the war, that was like in Daniel, 2 times and a half, 3.5 years were the key apocalyptic time frame in Daniel for the final apocalyptic war. And if you look at when James was thrown off the Temple Mount, it's 3.5 years before the uprising against Rome. 3.5 years, and I think they were following Danielian chronology.
A tradition even emerges that the death of James is the cause of the Jewish war, which seems that his death must have been awfully significant for there to have been even a tradition that the death of
Well, it was the immediate cause, let us say that, of what transpired. Then people like Bar Kokhba came along and continued it.
right, of course,
But the point was is that the war was brewing all the time against Roman control in, if you want to call it Palestina, which is what they called it. They derived that name from the Philistines, which
right.
how could you call them? They deliberately called the area a name inimical and hostile to all Jewish thought, the Philistines, as if there were any Philistines left. And so they called it Palestina after the Philistines, which was a complete, insult to the whole people of the area. I don't want to call it the people of Palestine, but I don't know what else to call it. So they totally insulted
And,
everybody,
and
and the
certainly,
war was brewing ever since,
and certainly the
from
scrolls
4
community.
BC onwards. Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
The Scrolls community certainly believed that the temple establishment had gone corrupt and they needed purer rituals, in
Oh,
effect,
absolutely. Right.
in the quote wilderness. And they had their own leadership structure for rituals. Um,
Well, I think someone like John the Baptist, is definitely a historical character, and the material in Josephus about John is reliable, basically. I think John is not just one of the initiators of this movement back in the 4 BC period, but clearly a member of this movement, however he might have died. And so this movement gets its start with people like him and personalities like him. And I think it certainly ends with people like James and the Masada suicides. And then I don't know how you want to relate Bar Kokhba to these people, but that's the title. He's son of the star.
the star,
So
right.
he sees himself as a messianic character. But that's the key, what people don't understand. They have deceived the whole public. They have talked about Essenes, and they go on about peaceful Essenes. But the point is, Hippolytus, the early church historian theologian, tells us there were 4 groups of Essenes, and the last 2, he says, were Zealots and Sicarii. And the Zealots are the movement that we're talking about here. At least that's what Josephus refers to them as. And the Sicarii are certainly the people on Masada. And they're supposed to get their name from the fact that they cut people's throats. But I don't think it was the fact that they cut people's throats. That was a Roman characterization of them. It was from the Sika, the short knife, dagger that they carried in their belts. And I don't think they were just cutting people's throats with that in an assassin type manner. The Sicarii were in this more movement to the very end, and I think so. When we talk about the scrolls, you get these peaceful Essenes. But if you look at their literature, the war of the sons of light against the sons
Yeah.
of darkness, the final apocalyptic war against all evil, they say, hate the sons of the pit. There's no loving your neighbor here, only
Right.
righteous neighbors. There is absolutely the opposite. This is an apocalyptic war community. And I call it, to me, the literature is the literature of the Messianic movement in Palestine. And it's all about the Messiah. He appears in the war scroll and so on. And he will, of course, be the ultimate leader. But he's going to lead this final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth. And a little bit of that has drifted into Christian ideology. But the point is, these people really believed it, and they were in the process of doing it. And that's how come they all disappeared and evaporated. If they hadn't all maybe disappeared and evaporated, we might have known more about them before we discovered their literature.
We've even found a fragment of sectarian scroll material at Masada, at least one.
Absolutely. Oh, yes. I think probably more than one, but the point is at least one, like you say. That's the key, that we know that the scroll people moved up to Masada. I mean, there was no one really hanging around Masada. Only the Sicarii and Zealots went up there. So that would be the scroll people. And they
And
didn't go up there to contemplate their navels. They
yeah, right.
and they, and they
Scrolls
didn't and they didn't commit suicide, mass suicide at the end. They were up there to fight the final apocalyptic war against evil and the Roman Empire and the Herodian establishment, which included our friend Pallas from Asia Minor, who was an Herodian stoolie. And I wouldn't even rely on one thing he said in his letters, not one thing, because except, the letters have been tainted, but even the authentic one where he says, that he, eat all the food in the butcher shops. No Jew, no apocalyptic Jew would even consider doing that. So the Christians are nice. They like the literature, which is fine. I don't want to insult them. And the literature's fine, and it makes people happy for some reason. But it really offends me, and it makes me feel, as you see, extremely aggressive. And I'm portrayed, Jews are portrayed so negatively in that literature, it's painful.
The anti-Semitic character of the New Testament, I think, is obvious to any fair reader.
Yeah, there's no doubt why the Holocaust occurred.
There's a story in Moses of Corinth's history of Armenia that I wanted to read real quick because
You want me to go and pull these things out of my brain?
well, the reason why I want to read this is because it reminded me of the Clementine recognitions about the murder of James. I wanted to see if after I read this real quick, I wanted to see if you notice the similarities. And it's not just me. Okay. It says, after the death of Abgar, the Armenian kingdom was divided into two. For his son Ananias was crowned to reign in Edessa, and his nephew Sennacherib in Armenia. Whatever occurred in their time has been previously described by others. The coming of the apostle Thaddeus to Armenia, the conversion of Sennacherib, his apostasy, for fear of the Armenian princes, the martyrdom of the apostle and those with him in the province of Shavarsham, which is now called Artas, the opening and closing of the rock, and its receiving of the apostle's body, its removal by his disciples and burial in the plain, the martyrdom of the king's daughter, Sennaduct, near the road. The revelation there of the relics of the two saints and their translation to the rocky place. All this, as we have said, others have related before us. So we did not consider it all important to repeat it in detail. Likewise, whatever concerns the death of Adi, the disciple of the apostle in Edessa, at the hands of Abgar's son, has been described by others before us. When the latter came to the throne after his father's death, he did not inherit his father's virtue, but he opened the temples of the idols and adhered to the pagan cult. He sent to Adi that he should make for him a tira of silk embroidered with gold, as he previously used to make for his father. And he received in reply, "My hands will not make a tire for an unworthy head that does not worship Christ, the living God." He immediately ordered one of his soldiers to cut off his feet with a sword. When the soldier came and saw him sitting on his chair of instruction, he drew his sword and cut off his legs. Straightway he gave up the spirit. We have recorded this very briefly, as it has been related by others before.
You sure do find some abstruse material, I'll give you that.
But does that remind you at all? Like, you got Ananias, he's killing Adi in this story after the death of King Abgar, which happened around 50 CE. And then, so this guy comes in there and he kills Adi after they get into a heated argument. And in Josephus, you have a guy called Ananias who murdered James. So that's what I wanted to ask.
Well, he was involved in the plot to destroy James. Ananias didn't physically murder James. He set him up to thrown off the temple wall.
He called the Sanhedrin, convicted James and his friends.
Right. He framed him for supposed blasphemy or whatever they were worked up about. But those are the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were cooperating with the Roman rule in Palestine, which is why you get those Gospels portraying the Pharisees so positively. But, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pharisees and the establishment Sadducees, not the scroll Sadducees,
Right.
who are opposition Sadducees, the establishment Sadducees are the enemies. And that's why I go only according to the scroll literature, because to my mind, that's the only, first of all, righteous literature, the only literature that reflects the mentality of the warriors who were willing to sacrifice themselves in the war against Rome, and all the others were collaborationists, and what else can we call them? There probably is another word, but it doesn't come off my lips with any love.
Well, whatever else we say about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were valued by the rebels because they were deposited in those caves around the Dead Sea at around 70, 71. So, I mean, they must have been valued by the rebels, and they must have been documents important to them because they were preserved right at the end.
The weird thing is nobody found them until centuries later, which is really impressive.
Right.
Except,
but from that circumstance alone, it suggests it's rebel literature.
Well, you're right, and I don't want to add anything to what you say. Your insight is more concise and more incisive often than I can put things. So it's perfectly accurate.
We could garbled accounts of James's death and later the Syriac or later Armenian literature. That wouldn't surprise you, would it?
Nothing surprises, but I have to remember these things, and I'm not sure if my mind has conserved everything that it ought to, but your mind does, so I'll defer to you. What do you think?
There is another intriguing parallel.
The material that you were reading there, Abgar was involved to some degree with the I think the Maccabeans in some way, and so he was part of the revolutionary or rebellious movement. But he's more in the Syria-Iraq framework, where similar things were going on, maybe related to this, and I don't doubt that they relate. But the material we're talking about relates to actual things that occurred before these people deposited their documents in the caves and disappeared up on Masada, where they knew they were either going to fight to the finish or commit suicide, but never surrender. That's really impressive.
There is another.
Can you really grasp what that means in this prayer? Never surrender. I mean, we talk about that in the Revolutionary Civil War, but my God, these people were doing it 2,000 years before us.
There's another intriguing parallel with the death of Adi in the story. Because
but no one knows about what you're talking about, so it's hard. You got to re-educate them about the whole literature, what it's about, and what these people are involved in, and that's a long course.
His murder, Ananias is later killed, and the story insinuates it was done for divine reasons. Ananias was killed because of what he had done to poor Adi, and it kind of reminded me of like the things that you've said before, of that the wicked priest in the Dead Sea Scrolls was killed for doing something terrible to one more righteous than he. And Josephus saying Ananias was later murdered during the Jewish War around
that's for sure.
68 CE.
Yeah, they would have cut his throat with their hands on him. These are Herodian puppets. And I have to say over and over again, so was Paul. That's why they treated him so well. And when he was under arrest, they helped him escape, and they took him down to Caesarea, and they sent him to, Asia Minor or Anatolia and things like that under protection. I mean, this fellow led a charmed life, and the only thing that he had some problems with were the superstitious religions of the Roman Empire that he was trying to replace, but that had nothing to do with his ideology, which was totally, I would say, cooperative. And if you like,
Bertini goes so far as to call the Roman state God's appointed agents on earth.
There you go.
No, that's going pretty far.
Yeah. Well, as I said, your mind moves further than mine at this point.
Well, and,
So,
and if the tradition in Acts is correct, the Romans sent an entire cohort of soldiers to protect him from the Jews. So,
yeah, right. Well, I don't blame the Jews if they had him in their sights, but he obviously was quite handy with escape mechanisms.
but as you point out in Romans, he indicates that he may have Herodian relatives.
He
His king
does. Yeah,
Herodian,
he sends
Aristotle.
he sends greetings to a whole list, 3 or 4 anyway, of Herodians.
I
And
have
in
to.
Philippians,
I would like to to expand on that because,
I don't have the documents in front of me, but James can.
yeah, I want to talk about that a bit because there are critics out there that literally
Critics.
attack this, and actually your argument convinced me, Professor Eisenman. I was convinced. I am convinced.
I'm not arguing. I'm just
that
looking at the literature. There it is. There's no
well
argument.
yes, I agree there as well. What I'm trying to say is I see what you're seeing. I see what you see, and Paul is related to the Herods. It seems clear.
I mean, we don't attack anybody. These people, maybe Paul, but these people are attacking because they feel threatened. But go ahead.
Would you when would you connect an incident in 2 Corinthians when Paul says he had to flee Damascus from Aretas? Would you connect that incident to Aretas going after Herod Antipas around 37 CE and Josephus? Do you think
I can't comment on that because my mind hasn't embraced it any longer, so I'll let you deal with it.
Well, the reason why I brought that up is because Aretas got mad at Herod Antipas because Herod Antipas's daughter divorced. Herod Antipas's daughter divorced him or his son. I don't remember which way that wind blows. And she fled Aretas to go back to the kingdom, and then that's when Aretas. Oh, wait a minute. I remember now. Herod Antipas divorced Aretas' daughter. That's what happened. Phasaelius, I think that's her name. And
relative of his own.
if I'm pronouncing her name right, that is. And then Aretas went after Herod. And this appears to be happening around the time Paul is supposed to be fleeing from Aretas in 2 Corinthians. It's like, it made me think like, well, if he's a kinsman to the Herods, that makes sense. He says he's a kinsman to the Herods and Romans. So he's fleeing from Aretas because Aretas is going after the Herods and the whole family.
Right. That's consistent. It's also consistent when we read in his letter to the Philippians that he's got full access to everyone in the imperial guard. He sent greetings from Caesar's household. He knows a guy named Epaphroditus, who may be this very important imperial freedman. So in Philippians, he's got these really impressive connections with the Roman state, and in Romans, he appears to have Herodian relatives.
Yeah, exactly. So why wouldn't he have these connections? Being an Herodian, he is an Herodian. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
He is an Herodian,
and
they weren't even looked upon as being Jewish. They were imposed by the Romans on the Palestinian entity as rulers in place of the Maccabees, and they were like total collaborators. And this is collaborationist literature. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I mean, it's well done, and it has nice implications, like again turning the other cheek. Everyone likes that idea, or loving your enemy, or all those. But in the context of Palestine,
I'm more of the eye for an eye guy. If you can fight back. I'm not.
In the context of Palestinian history, this could never go down except with collaborators.
Yeah, see, it's such extreme. Love your enemy and go the extra mile. And a Roman centurion has more faith than any, son of Israel. Wow, that's quite a.
Yes. Well, I don't like laughing at things, and only people like you and I can laugh at this. The people who are, into it and connected to it, they can't find anything laughable in it, and I feel bad for them. They have been drawn into a literature that is very seductive and extremely pleasing. And I'm glad that they feel that way, but they shouldn't let it taint their historical outlook.
And Paul does have some beautiful poetic imagery, but he gets some of those, I think, you demonstrated to me from the Dead Sea Scrolls community.
Probably. I can't remember those things now so well, so I don't know which
Oh, well, the
imagery
cup
you
of God's wrath and so forth. We
Oh
long
yeah.
thought that that was poetic
Oh well,
imagery.
yeah.
Paul,
That's all Dead Sea Scroll literature.
exactly. You
Hmm.
demonstrate. Another thing I would alert our listeners to: Professor Eisenman has conclusively demonstrated ideological, even linguistic links between the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents and the Pauline epistles. There is no question of a relationship there. Professor Eisenman has, in my view, conclusively demonstrated it.
Yeah, but the only thing is one has inverted the other. That's all.
Oh, completely turned it inside. Yes, I should say. Paul has turned it upside down and inside out in the process.
Right. It's
But he
totally
totally
inverted. So
does.
that's why people should read the literature of the scrolls in their own way, not through the eyes of scholars, because the scholars are trying to rescue the scroll literature through the prism of Christianity. And, it can't be done. And Jewish scholars are totally at sea. Some have found their way, but most are totally at sea in this. And the Israelis, in particular, they don't have any deep seated ideological approach to anything. So they don't see this through nationalist eyes. And I don't know why some of us outsiders who do see it through nationalist eyes have to be the spokesman for this.
Right. Well, I think
I mean,
there's a.
I feel totally at home in the Dead Sea Scroll literature. I'm waiting for the Heavenly Host to join my camp. Happy to greet them and join them and go with them to carry on this apocalyptic war against not just the Romans, but all evil on the earth.
Jacob.
There's
He's thinking.
Yeah.
well, I wasn't sure if James had a question there, but
No,
yeah,
I'm just blown away by the answer.
there's a text that you talk about in your book. I don't know if you remember it. The
No, I probably don't.
well, I'll throw it in here anyway. Let's see what happens. The second apocalypse of James. It it mentions that James the Just is the son of Theudas, that rebel at the Jordan River who rebelled against the Romans around
I
40.
have no memory of that, so I'm at sea.
It is, Professor Eisman is really interesting. The second apocalypse of James is thought by most scholars to be older than what's called the first apocalypse of James, and may have material that goes pretty far back, maybe even into the first century. And it straight out calls this James the son of Theudas, the rebel.
I can't comment on it because I don't think that we know the background of James, if they actually were brothers or any of the others.
Would it surprise you if
But
he was a member of the
we
family?
do think that these were Galileans, but may just because Galileans was another name for revolutionary too. So we just don't know their genealogical historical origins well enough. But we do know that they were righteous ones. That's the only thing that I will rely on, righteous
Would it
ones.
surprise you if someone like James or John the Baptist or Theudas or Judas the
And
Galilean,
John is definitely a righteous one. What are you saying?
would it surprise you that these figures were relatives or related to one another?
No, not at all. I believe they probably were.
Do you think
You
that the
have to
Judas
be
Galilean,
a relative of someone to be willing to, go as far as they go and commit themselves to the extent that they do. So I think that they are, but I don't believe in John and James, the son of Zebedee, or or those kind of quasi-fictional characters who are deliberately introduced to replace the historical people. And I think that's so sad. And for the historical people, and they have survived, and we have to be fanatics like us, you and me, etc., that have to revive them. And not many people are going to, be swayed by what we have to say because we'd be looked upon as fanatics.
outsiders, fanatics? Yes.
Judas the
What about
Galilean had a partner in a lieutenant that was fighting alongside him called Sadok. At least that's how.
Saduk,
Yeah. Well, that
Saduk.
Sadok. That's
Yeah.
would you say that raises a red flag right there? That, oh, look at that! Look at that name right there. It's Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean. That's a link between him and the Qumran sect.
Oh, absolutely. That links them completely, because it's a derivative of tzaddik, tzaduk, tzaddik, tzadok. These are all manifestations of the ZDK root, and the ZDK root always has the same implication. So we have variations on a theme here. But one thing we have in the scrolls, and I like to come back to them because they're the only literature that I really pay any attention to in the end, is this ZDK theme runs all through the scrolls, is just the basic underlying theme of the whole literature. And then we have this individual thrown off the temple wall called ZDK, the just, the Zadok, the Tzaddik, which is really, to my mind, so, strikingly insightful that nobody could miss it if they were willing to have a look. That's why I love James so much. And you got his name. My God, there you are, the present day James.
We have a Yaakov and a James over here, so we have two.
No one gave me a Hebrew name when I was born. I don't have a Hebrew name, and I don't accept that they like to try other kinds of names in Israel when I was there. But none of them ever stuck on me. So I just kept my own name, and that was it.
A name that will live forever, sir.
Oh, that's very sweet of you. You're very kind. Well, how are we doing? We're okay. My neck is beginning to hurt. Holding this and looking down at this iPad. Got any last tongue twisters to give us, Jacob?
Let me see here. I'm trying to
think one up.
Yeah, let me see if I can think one up. I wanted to ask you. Yeah, here we go. I remember. I wanted to ask you something related to a question connected to King Abgar.
Oh God, you're out in another universe again.
Well, in the works of Josephus talks about the Adia Beni a few times. Yeah, and there are certain texts that seems to portray them as being in bed with the rebels, like Monobazes and Kenadius, as you talked about. Absolutely. But there are other texts that I want to ask you about that seems to portray the opposite. Like the what's it? I think it's called the History of the Wars by Justinian.
Oh well, come on.
I know that's late.
The thing is that in literature you can twist and turn and move things around like pieces on a chessboard as much as you want. But the only things that you should rely on and bring into the discussion are things that make sense and are basically historical. And you can't start taking something by Justinian as something you're going to really find anything very insightful in, I don't think.
There is something else.
These people were involved with the revolutionary group, so there's no doubt about that. Even Josephus is a hostile witness, even from his standpoint. They're a marvelous group, and they should have all the respect that one can give them.
Right.
What about this? One more question regarding that. There is another person called King Zamaris. He's mentioned in the Antiquities, and he.
What's his name?
Zamaris. Zamaris. And
boy, you really have pulled these people out of the obscurity bowl.
And he's called the king of the Babylonian Jews, and he fled Iraq.
Spell that name again.
Zamaris.
Well, if he's king of the Babylonian Jews, the question is he on the collaborationist Pharisee side, or is he on the opposition revolutionary Sadducean?
Herod, according to Josephus, Herod gave him land. So it looks and with tax
Well,
exemptions.
he'll be a collaboration.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all.
Herod
That's yeah.
Herod never made any mistakes. He obviously was a keen judge of character of people that he would be able to.
But you can see here, this is a
comfort.
great example. You can just see how Professor Eisenman's distinctions make far better sense than, say, the labels that, the simple labels that Josephus gives us about contemporary Jews. This is Professor Eisenman's distinctions are the ones that cut right through it, as you could just see from the question there. This Damaris guy is working with the Romans and the Herods. He's a collaborator. He's not a
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
He's not one of our nationalist Torah Orthodox.
We have to first see them as nationalists. That's the whole point.
That's it.
Willing to go to the final degree and risk their lives to the end point. These are absolutely dedicated people. These are not collaborators in any shape, way, or form.
Right. And at Adiabeni, at least we have one of these kingdoms that sort of is in the hinterland between the Parthian and Roman Empire, and both the Parthians and the Romans at different times were undoubtedly courting them and trying to get them on their side. And no doubt the Jewish rebels tried to get them on their side during the war as well. And I think Josephus's evidence is that there was Adiabeni participation among rebels, just as there was even a few Herods who apparently the same moment went over. But I see them as largely a Roman client state at the time.
Probably, but again, I haven't studied them to the extent you both have, so I wouldn't be able to draw any better insight than you have. Well, guys, my neck is almost coming off. I apologize for being a spoilsport here, but if you have any final comments you want me to make on something, tell me what I have to say and I'll say it. Other than that, I think James has the whole thing in his hand and I don't have to even do anything, just follow him.
My final question.
Oh, a question, my God, okay.
Yeah, my final question for you. So you talked about a chronological. You pointed out a contradiction in the Pauline chronology, and it's very intriguing to me because.
Did I really? Yeah, you've studied these things more closely than I have recently. But go ahead.
Well, it's about his escape from Damascus, because according to Josephus, Saul, the kinsman of Agrippa, he says Josephus is being very specific that he's a kinsman of the Herods. You've pointed that out before in your books many times. Saul, when he fled from Jerusalem in 66 CE, when the war started, the very next paragraph right after that, the Jews start going after traitors in Damascus. And it kind of reminded me of the Damascus escape scene in 2 Corinthians. You also pointed out in your books that in Acts, it appeared Paul's escape from Damascus, or Paul's escape in a basket in Acts, is 30 years later than 2 Corinthians places it.
Well, I mean, I don't have a recollection of the date of the basket scene. I'd have to look at the surrounding literature for that scene. I don't have it at my fingertips. But I think that his escape would certainly be somewhere in the 50s, I would imagine, or early 60s. And that's where we're putting this whole situation. I mean, I think we are beginning with Paul somewhere in the late 40s at the most, early 50s, and we carry through till he gets his protection under his Roman citizenship in Rome. But of course, then there's trouble there finally. But that's okay. That's another day.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Professor Eisenman.
Well, I'm lucky to have James here to back me up. Otherwise, I'd be lost. I'd be lost in the underbrush. But
No,
it's nice of you guys to be interested in this, and all your kind words are much appreciated. And my regards to all your viewers, and hope that we can have as much success with this as you had with your previous one, which was well done for sure.
Thank you very much. Always insightful and a pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thanks again, Dr. Eisenman.
My pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.